The most dangerous moment in a marriage is not when betrayal begins, but when dignity decides to answer. The chandeliers above the Grand Aurelius ballroom shimmered like frozen stars, scattering light across a sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos, the kind of night where power whispered in handshakes and fortunes moved between glasses of champagne, and at the center of it all stood Ethan Carter, white billionaire, CEO, a man who had built his empire on precision and control, a man who never made mistakes in public until tonight, because across the polished marble floor, beneath the soft hum of a live string quartet, he leaned just a little too close to a woman who was not his wife, his hand resting at her waist in a way that was subtle enough to deny, but clear enough to confirm, and the room felt it before anyone said a word, that quiet shift in the air when something perfect begins to crack. A few guests noticed first, eyes flickering, whispers forming behind practiced smiles, but Ethan didn't pull away, didn't notice, or didn't care, and that was the moment everything changed, because standing just 10 feet away, holding a champagne flute she hadn't sipped from, Ava Brooks saw everything, every second of it, not with shock, not with chaos, but with a stillness so complete it almost looked like grace, her deep brown skin glowing under the golden light, her crimson gown catching every reflection like controlled fire, and if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen it, not heartbreak, not yet, but calculation, because Ava did not react the way stories expect women to react. She didn't drop the glass, didn't rush forward, didn't raise her voice. Instead she stood there, shoulders relaxed, breathing steady, as if the moment had already passed and what mattered now was what came next. The orchestra continued playing, a soft swell of violins that seemed almost ironic against the quiet tension spreading through the room, and Ethan finally turned, laughing at something the other woman said, only to freeze when his eyes met Ava's across the distance, because in that instant, something unfamiliar moved through him, not fear exactly, but recognition, like standing at the edge of something irreversible, and Ava held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, no more, no less, before lifting her glass slightly in a gesture that looked almost like a toast, her expression composed, unreadable, powerful, and then she turned away, not toward the exit like anyone would expect, but toward the center of the ballroom, toward the stage where the evening's keynote speech was scheduled to take place, her heels clicking softly against the marble with each measured step, the sound precise, intentional, cutting through the low murmur beginning to ripple across the crowd, because now people were watching, not openly, not yet, but enough to feel that something was unfolding, something they didn't understand but couldn't ignore, and Ava moved through them like she belonged to a different frequency entirely, her posture effortless, her chin slightly lifted, her presence commanding without asking for permission, and the closer she got to the stage, the quieter the room became, conversations trailing off mid-sentence, glasses pausing mid-air, because there is a kind of silence that doesn't come from absence, but from anticipation. And this was that kind of silence. Ethan took a step forward, instinct pulling him toward her, but something stopped him, something in the way she walked, in the certainty of her movement, as if she had already decided the outcome of a conversation no one else had heard yet, and for the first time that night, the man who controlled everything felt out of control, while Ava reached the steps of the stage, placing her glass gently on a passing tray without breaking stride, her fingers steady, her movements unhurried, and when she stepped up into the light, the chandeliers seemed to dim around her, not literally, but in the way attention shifts, in the way a room reorients itself around a single presence, and she turned to face the crowd, her eyes sweeping over them briefly before settling somewhere beyond, somewhere calm, somewhere resolute, and if anyone had expected anger, they were disappointed, because what they saw instead was something far more unsettling, peace, the kind that comes not from acceptance, but from decision, and as the microphone stood waiting just inches from her lips, untouched, the entire ballroom held its breath without realizing it, suspended in that fragile space between what was and what was about to be, while Ethan Carter, the man who had never lost control of a room in his life, stood frozen at the edge of it, watching his wife become something he no longer recognized, and something he could no longer stop. The silence did not break. When Ava Brooks reached for the microphone, it deepened, stretched thin across the ballroom like glass waiting to crack, and for a moment she did not speak, she simply stood there, letting the weight of the room settle into her bones, letting every eye adjust to her presence, because power, real power, never rushes. Her fingers brushed lightly against the stand, steady, controlled, and when she finally lifted the microphone, the faint echo of movement seemed louder than any voice could be. While Ethan Carter took another step forward from the crowd, his pulse uneven in a way he had not felt in years, watching her with an intensity that bordered on disbelief, because Ava was not supposed to be here, not like this, not in control of the narrative he had unknowingly set into motion. "Good evening," she said, her voice smooth, calm, carrying effortlessly across the room without needing force, and a few people shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether this was planned or something far more dangerous, because there was no tremor in her tone, no trace of humiliation, only clarity, the kind that comes after something inside a person has already made peace with the truth. "I was not scheduled to speak tonight," she continued, her gaze drifting briefly across the audience before returning to a neutral point just above their heads, as if she were addressing something larger than the room itself. "But sometimes life does not wait for permission to reveal what matters," and a quiet ripple moved through the guests, subtle but undeniable, while Ethan's jaw tightened, his mind racing through possibilities, through damage control, through explanations that suddenly felt small and insufficient, because whatever Ava was about to do, it was not going to be undone with words. She paused then, not for effect, but because the moment required it, because silence, when used correctly, becomes its own language, and in that pause, the entire ballroom leaned in without moving, drawn by something they could not name. "There is a difference," she said softly, "between building something that looks perfect and building something that is real." Her eyes lowered for just a fraction of a second, not in weakness, but in reflection, as if she were acknowledging a truth she had carried long before this night. "And sometimes, the hardest part is realizing you have been protecting the illusion instead of the truth." A woman near the front glanced at her companion, a silent exchange passing between them, because now it was clear this was not a speech about business or charity or celebration. This was something else entirely, something personal, something precise. Ethan felt the shift fully now, the way the room was no longer his, no longer aligned with his presence, but orbiting around Ava instead, and it unsettled him in a way no boardroom ever had. Because in business, he could predict outcomes, he could calculate risk, but here, standing among people who were beginning to understand, he was no longer in control of the story being told. Ava's hand relaxed slightly on the microphone, her posture unchanged, her voice never rising, never breaking. "I spent years believing that loyalty meant silence," she said, each word measured, deliberate, that strength meant holding everything together, even when it was already falling apart, and there it was. Not accusation, not exposure, but something more refined, something sharper, because she was not naming him, she was defining herself, and in doing so, she was rewriting the entire frame of the moment. A man near the back cleared his throat quietly, the smallest sound amplified by the stillness, while Ethan's gaze never left her, searching for something familiar, something he could hold on to, but finding nothing except a version of Ava he had never truly seen before. "But tonight," she continued, and for the first time there was a hint of something warmer in her tone, not softness, but certainty. "I realized that dignity does not come from what we endure, it comes from what we choose." Her words settled over the crowd like a quiet verdict, not loud, not dramatic, but final, and a few people straightened unconsciously, as if responding to an unspoken command. Ava lifted her chin slightly, her eyes now steady, focused, present. "So I am choosing," she said, the sentence simple, but carrying a weight that could not be ignored, "to no longer stand beside anything that asks me to shrink in order to survive." And this time, the silence that followed was different, heavier, charged, because now they understood, not every detail, not every history, but enough to feel the shift from private moment to public truth. Ethan's breath caught, subtle but real, because in that single sentence, she had drawn a line he could not cross back over, a line that did not require explanation to be understood. And around him, the room remained still, watching, waiting, as Ava Brooks stood in the center of it all, not as a wife reacting to betrayal, but as a woman defining her own ending. And for the first time that night, the outcome no longer belonged to him. The words did not echo, but they lingered, settling into the corners of the room like something permanent, and Ava Brooks let them rest there without rushing to fill the silence, because she understood something most people in that ballroom did not. When truth is spoken clearly, it does not need decoration, it needs space. Her fingers loosened slightly around the microphone, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, while across the room Ethan Carter felt the full weight of what had just happened pressing against his chest, not as a sudden blow, but as a slow realization unfolding piece by piece. Because Ava had not exposed him, she had done something far more devastating. She had removed herself, and in doing so, she had removed the foundation he had quietly depended on for years without ever acknowledging it. A murmur began to ripple through the guests now, subtle but growing, not loud enough to disrupt the moment, but enough to confirm that everyone understood the shift that had just taken place, the invisible line Ava had drawn between who she had been and who she had chosen to become, and Ethan's instinct pushed him forward again, one step, then another, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor, his focus locked entirely on her, because there are moments when a man realizes that control is an illusion, and this was his. Ava turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge movement in her peripheral vision, and for a brief second their eyes met again, but this time there was no question in hers, no searching, no hesitation, only recognition, as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time and finding nothing left to negotiate, and that was what stopped him, more than the crowd, more than the setting, more than the consequences. It was the absence of any emotional opening, the quiet certainty that whatever existed between them had already been closed. She shifted her attention back to the audience, lifting the microphone once more. Her voice unchanged, measured, composed. "I believe," she said, each word placed with intention, "that the way we show up in our most public moments reveals who we have been in private all along." And the sentence landed differently, sharper now, because it was no longer abstract, it carried context, it carried implication, and it carried consequence without ever naming a single detail, while Ethan's breath slowed, controlled, his expression carefully neutral as years of practiced composure returned to his face, but it was different now, thinner, more fragile, because control maintained under pressure is not the same as control built on certainty. Ava's gaze moved across the room again, not searching for approval, not seeking validation, simply acknowledging the space she was standing in. "Tonight is not about humiliation," she continued, and a few heads lifted at that, surprised by the direction, "and it is not about blame." Her tone remained even, almost gentle, but there was steel beneath it, unmistakable. "It is about clarity," and the word seemed to settle over the audience like a quiet agreement, because clarity does not need volume, it needs precision. Ethan stopped moving entirely now, standing just at the edge of the gathered crowd, close enough to hear every word without effort, far enough to remain outside the center of attention, and for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what to say. He was thinking about what he had already lost. Ava lowered the microphone slightly, just enough to let a breath pass between her words. "There are moments in life," she said, softer now, but no less clear, "when you realize that staying silent is not strength, it is permission." And a subtle shift moved through the room again, because now the message was undeniable, not loud, not accusatory, but exact, like a line drawn with deliberate care, and in that moment, everyone understood that this was not a reaction, it was a decision that had been forming long before tonight. Ava's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly, as if something heavy had been set down, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a finality that did not need to announce itself. "So this is me choosing differently," she said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than anything dramatic could have, because there was no anger in it, no chaos, only direction, and that made it impossible to challenge. The orchestra had long since stopped playing, though no one could say exactly when, the music replaced by something quieter, something more powerful, the sound of a room witnessing a shift it could not reverse, and Ava Brooks stood at the center of it, not as someone reacting to a moment, but as someone defining it, while Ethan Carter remained just outside her reach, finally understanding that this was not a moment he could fix, not with words, not with presence, not with power, because the decision had already been made, and this time, it did not belong to him. The air did not move, yet everything inside the ballroom had shifted, as if the invisible architecture of power had quietly rearranged itself around a single decision, and Ava Brooks felt it, not as pressure, but as release, the kind that comes when something long carried is finally set down without apology, her hand lowering the microphone with deliberate calm as her gaze swept the room one final time, not searching for agreement, not asking for understanding, simply acknowledging what was now undeniable. While Ethan Carter stood motionless at the edge of the crowd, his mind no longer racing for solutions but circling something far more unsettling, the realization that this was not a moment he could outmaneuver, because Ava had not confronted him in the way he understood. She had redefined the entire context in which confrontation existed. A faint clink of glass echoed from somewhere in the distance, small, almost accidental, yet it broke the stillness just enough for the room to remember itself. A low murmur beginning to return, voices carefully measured, conversations restarting in fragments, but the focus never fully leaving the stage, never fully leaving her, because once a shift like this is witnessed, it cannot be unseen. Ava stepped back from the microphone, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same composure she had carried into the moment, her heels touching the polished floor of the stage with quiet precision, and for a brief second, she allowed herself a breath that belonged only to her, steady, grounding, before turning slightly toward the steps, her posture unchanged, her pace unhurried, because departure, like arrival, is a statement when done with intention. Ethan moved then, instinct overriding hesitation, closing the distance between himself and the stage in a few controlled strides. His expression composed, his voice ready, but when he reached the base of the steps, he stopped, because Ava was already descending, already stepping down into the space between them, and there was something in the way she approached that made interruption feel inappropriate, not because of the setting, not because of the audience, but because of her, because of the clarity she carried with her like a boundary no one else could cross. She paused just long enough to stand within arm's reach, her eyes meeting his again, and for the first time that night, the world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact, the crowd fading into a distant blur of expectation, of curiosity, of silent judgment, and Ethan opened his mouth, the beginning of a sentence forming, something measured, something controlled, but Ava lifted her hand slightly, not touching him, not blocking him, simply signaling, and that was enough to stop him. Because the gesture held no aggression, no urgency, only certainty, and certainty is difficult to argue with. You do not need to explain, she said quietly, her voice low enough that only he could hear, yet clear enough to carry weight, and the simplicity of the statement landed heavier than any accusation could have, because it removed the very foundation of defense, it made explanation irrelevant, and Ethan felt it, that absence of negotiation, that absence of space to correct or reframe, and for a moment, something almost unfamiliar moved through his expression, not anger, not frustration, but something closer to understanding, though not complete, not yet. Ava held his gaze for a second longer, just enough to confirm that what needed to be said had already been said, and then she stepped past him, not brushing against him, not hesitating, simply continuing forward as if the path had always been clear, her crimson dress catching the light with every movement, not as decoration, but as presence, a visual echo of the transformation that had just taken place. The crowd parted instinctively, creating space without being asked, conversations quieting again as she moved through them, and there was something almost reverent in the way people watched her now, not out of pity, not out of scandal, but out of recognition, because they had just witnessed something rare, something controlled, something that did not rely on spectacle to make its impact. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, standing at the edge of the stage, the center he once occupied now empty in a way that felt different, not diminished, but altered, as if the definition of power had shifted without his consent, and when he finally turned, the room looked different to him, not because it had changed, but because he had begun to see it through the absence of someone he had never fully understood the presence of until now. Near the exit, Ava paused briefly, not to look back, not to reconsider, but to allow the doors to open fully before stepping into the quieter hallway beyond, the sound of the ballroom softening behind her, replaced by a stillness that felt almost like relief. And as the doors closed gently, sealing the moment behind her, what remained inside was not chaos, not confrontation, but something far more lasting, the memory of a woman who chose dignity over reaction, and in doing so, changed the entire outcome without ever raising her voice. The hallway outside the ballroom felt quieter than it should have, as if the world itself had paused to catch up with what had just unfolded, and Ava Brooks walked through it with the same steady rhythm, her heels echoing softly against the polished floor, each step measured, intentional, carrying her further away from a life that had already begun to loosen its hold on her long before tonight, and for the first time in what felt like years. The silence around her did not feel heavy, it felt clear, like space that belonged to her again. Behind her, the muffled hum of voices slowly returned inside the ballroom, conversations reshaping themselves around a narrative no one could fully control anymore. While Ethan Carter remained standing where she had left him, his hands at his sides, his posture still composed but no longer anchored, because something fundamental had shifted beneath him, something he could not stabilize with logic or authority, and the absence of Ava's presence was no longer subtle, it was definitive, a space he could feel without seeing. Ava reached the end of the corridor where the city lights filtered in through tall glass panels, the glow of downtown stretching out into the night, steady and indifferent, and she paused there for a moment, not out of hesitation, but acknowledgement, because endings deserve to be witnessed, even When they are chosen, and she allowed herself a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as the cool air met her skin, grounding her in the reality of what she had just done, not impulsive, not reactive, but deliberate. A memory flickered briefly at the edge of her mind, not vivid, not overwhelming, just enough to remind her of the years she had spent building something she believed in, standing beside a man the world respected, contributing in ways that were never announced, never celebrated in rooms like the one she had just left. And there was no bitterness in the thought, only clarity, because now she understood that quiet contributions do not lose their value when they are no longer recognized, they simply change direction. Inside the ballroom, Ethan finally moved, his steps slower now, less certain, as he navigated through clusters of guests who shifted subtly to make space for him, their expressions carefully neutral, their eyes saying more than their words ever would, because in rooms like this, perception is currency, and tonight, his had changed, not destroyed, but altered in a way that could not be undone by a single explanation, and for the first time, he was not thinking about how to control the narrative, he was thinking about how quickly it had slipped beyond his reach. He stopped near the bar, his reflection catching briefly in the mirrored surface behind it, and for a moment, he did not recognize the man looking back at him, not because of how he appeared, but because of what he now understood about the foundation beneath that image, the assumptions he had made, the things he had taken for granted, the presence he had relied on without ever truly seeing. And it was not regret that defined the moment, not yet, but awareness, the kind that arrives quietly and stays. Ava reached for the handle of the exit door, her fingers resting against the cool metal for a second before pushing it open, and the night air greeted her with a softness that felt almost intentional, the distant sound of traffic blending into a steady rhythm that contrasted the controlled tension she had left behind. And as she stepped outside, the city did not react, it did not pause or shift, it simply continued, and there was something comforting in that, something grounding, because life does not stop for personal revelations, it absorbs them, carries them forward. A car waited near the curb, its presence understated, its driver stepping forward as soon as he saw her, opening the door with a quiet nod. But Ava did not move immediately. Instead she turned slightly, not toward the ballroom, not toward the past, but toward the skyline, her eyes tracing the lines of buildings that stretched into the distance, each window holding a story she would never know. And in that moment, she understood something simple and undeniable, that her story did not end in that room, it began again outside of it. Inside, Ethan remained still for a moment longer before finally lifting his gaze from his reflection, the noise of the room returning around him, the music slowly resuming as if the evening could continue uninterrupted. But he knew better, because while events can resume, meaning does not reset. And what had been revealed tonight would not disappear with time, it would follow him, shape him, challenge him in ways he had never prepared for, because power, once redefined, cannot be returned to its previous form. Ava stepped into the car without looking back, her movements calm, her expression composed, and as the door closed softly behind her, sealing the quiet space around her, there was no rush of emotion, no dramatic release, only a steady sense of alignment, as if for the first time in a long while. Her actions matched her worth without compromise, and as the car pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the flow of the city, what remained behind was not a broken moment, but a completed one, defined not by what had been lost, but by what had been chosen. The city moved around her in a quiet blur of light and motion as the car carried Ava Brooks away from the ballroom, the glow of streetlights sliding across the window in steady intervals, each passing reflection dissolving as quickly as it appeared, and she watched them without attachment, her posture relaxed against the leather seat, her hands resting loosely in her lap, because for the first time in a long while, she was not holding anything together, she was simply allowing things to move forward without her resistance. The driver kept his eyes on the road, the hum of the engine low and consistent, a rhythm that matched the calm settling inside her chest, not emptiness, not relief, but alignment, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but reveals itself in the absence of tension. And Ava let that feeling expand quietly, without questioning it, without trying to define it too quickly, because clarity, once found, does not need to be rushed into explanation. Her phone remained untouched beside her, its screen dark, silent, though she knew it would not stay that way for long, because rooms like the one she had left behind do not hold moments quietly, they carry them outward, reshape them, retell them. But tonight, she had no interest in narratives beyond her own, no urgency to manage perception, no desire to correct assumptions, because what mattered had already been said, and it had been said without compromise, across the city, in the upper floors of a glass tower that bore his name in quiet lettering. Ethan Carter stood alone in his office hours later, the skyline stretching beyond him in sharp lines of light and shadow, the reflection of the city merging with his own in the floor-to-ceiling windows, and for once, the view did not feel like ownership, it felt like distance, like something he was looking at rather than something he controlled. The gala had continued without him for only a short while before he left, his exit less noticeable than it should have been, because attention had already shifted, already attached itself to something else. And now, standing in the silence of his office, the absence of noise felt louder than any room he had ever commanded. His jacket lay draped over the back of a chair, his tie loosened, the precise lines of his appearance slightly undone, not from carelessness, but from distraction, because his thoughts did not follow their usual structured paths. They returned instead to a single moment, a single look, the way Ava had met his gaze without hesitation and without invitation. And he realized now that it was not her words that unsettled him the most, it was her certainty, the quiet finality of someone who no longer needed anything from him. He moved slowly toward his desk, his hand brushing against the surface where documents lay neatly arranged, reports, projections, decisions waiting to be made, and for years, this space had been the center of his control, the place where outcomes were determined, where variables were calculated, but tonight, it felt different, not irrelevant, but incomplete, because none of it addressed what had just shifted beyond these walls. Ava turned her head slightly as the car passed over a bridge, the city opening up around her in wider stretches of light, the river below reflecting the skyline in fractured patterns that never held still, and she watched it for a moment, recognizing something in that movement, something about how reflection is never the same as reality, no matter how close it appears, and she allowed herself a small breath, deeper this time, as if acknowledging a truth she no longer needed to carry quietly. Her thoughts did not return to the ballroom, not in detail, not in replay, because she had already moved past the need to relive it. Instead they moved forward, not into certainty, but into possibility, into the quiet understanding that her life was no longer defined by a role she had outgrown, and that realization did not overwhelm her, it steadied her, gave her a sense of direction that did not require urgency to feel real. Back in the office, Ethan reached for his phone at last, the screen lighting up with missed calls, messages, notifications that had already begun to form their own version of the night, but he did not open them immediately, his thumb hovering for a second before lowering the device back onto the desk, because for once, he was not interested in what others were saying. He was focused on what had been said directly to him without words, the absence of negotiation, the removal of expectation, and he understood now that there are consequences that do not arrive with confrontation, they arrive with silence, with departure, with the quiet closing of a door that does not reopen. The car slowed as it approached Ava's building, the entrance lit softly, familiar yet somehow different in the way it welcomed her now, not as someone returning to a shared life, but as someone stepping into her own. And as the vehicle came to a stop, she reached for the handle without hesitation, her movements fluid, unburdened, the kind that come when there is nothing left to reconsider. And as she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the night air met her again, cool, steady, real, and she did not pause this time, did not look back, because she no longer needed to measure the distance between where she had been and where she was going. She simply moved forward, her pace calm, her presence unchanged, her direction finally her own. Morning arrived without announcement, a soft grey light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ava Brooks' apartment as the city began its quiet transition from night to motion, and she stood barefoot near the glass, a cup of untouched coffee warming her hands, her reflection faint against the skyline that stretched endlessly beyond her, and for a moment, she simply observed, not analyzing, not anticipating, just allowing herself to exist in the stillness that had followed a decision. She did not regret. Her phone, resting on the marble counter behind her, had not remained silent. Messages had come through in waves during the night, missed calls, notifications, fragments of curiosity disguised as concern, but she had not answered them, not because she was avoiding anything, but because she no longer felt the urgency to respond to narratives she had not created, and that absence of urgency felt unfamiliar at first. Then quietly empowering, across the city, Ethan Carter had not slept, the hours between midnight and morning dissolving into a continuous stretch of thought that refused to settle into clarity, and now he stood in the same office, his tie discarded, his sleeves rolled back, the sharp lines of his usual composure softened by something less defined, something unsettled, and as the first light of day touched the glass behind him, he found himself staring not at the city, but at the reflection of his own posture, the way his shoulders held tension he could not release, the way his expression no longer matched the certainty he had built his life upon. Ava turned slightly, setting the cup down without drinking from it, her fingers brushing the cool surface of the counter as she reached for her phone at last, the screen lighting up instantly, revealing a flood of names, colleagues, acquaintances, numbers she recognized and some she did not, all reaching toward her in different ways. But she did not scroll through them immediately. Instead she opened a single message she had written the night before, one she had not yet sent, and read it again, not to revise it, but to confirm that it still reflected what she intended. Because clarity, once formed, does not require constant adjustment, it requires commitment. Ethan exhaled slowly, moving away from the window at last, his steps measured as he approached his desk, the familiar layout of reports and schedules waiting for him. But for the first time in years, they did not command his attention, not because they lacked importance, but because they no longer felt central. And as he reached for his phone again, this time he unlocked it, scanning the notifications briefly before selecting one name, Ava's, his thumb hovering over the call button, then stopping, not out of hesitation exactly, but out of recognition, the understanding that whatever conversation he thought he could initiate no longer existed in the same form, because the context had changed, and he had not been the one to change it. Ava pressed send, the message leaving her phone without ceremony, without hesitation. A simple action that carried no visible weight yet defined everything that followed, and she set the device down again, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, because what she had written was not emotional, it was not reactive, it was precise, outlining her departure from shared commitments, from joint decisions, from a partnership that no longer aligned with her sense of self, and in its simplicity, it carried more finality than any argument ever could. Ethan's phone vibrated almost immediately, the timing too exact to ignore, and when he saw her name appear, something in his chest tightened, not sharply, but steadily, as he opened the message, his eyes moving across the words quickly at first, then slower, absorbing not just the content, but the tone, the absence of accusation, the absence of negotiation, and that was what held him in place, because there was nothing in it to respond to in the way he was used to, no opening to reframe, no emotional thread to follow, only a clear direction that did not include him. Ava stepped away from the counter, moving toward the hallway where her coat hung neatly, her movements unhurried, each action aligned with the next, and as she slipped into her shoes, she did not feel the need to check her phone again, did not feel the pull of expectation or response, because she understood something now that she had only sensed before, that closure does not come from mutual agreement, it comes from internal decision. And once the decision is made, the rest becomes movement, not conflict. Ethan lowered the phone slowly, placing it back onto the desk with a care that felt almost deliberate, as if the action itself required acknowledgement, and he remained there for a moment, standing in the quiet of his office, the city fully awake beyond him now, traffic building, people moving, the world continuing in its predictable rhythm. And yet nothing felt predictable anymore, because the structure he had relied on, the assumptions he had never questioned, had shifted without his control, and for the first time, he was not considering how to regain control, he was considering what it meant that he no longer had it. Ava reached the door of her apartment, her hand resting briefly on the handle before opening it, the hallway beyond lit evenly, familiar, steady, and she stepped through without looking back, not because she was forcing herself forward, but because there was nothing behind her that required her attention anymore. And as the door closed softly behind her, the sound was not an ending, it was a transition, one that did not demand recognition from anyone else to be real, because she had already recognized it for herself. The city did not slow down for anyone, and as Ava Brooks stepped onto the sidewalk that morning, the rhythm of movement surrounded her immediately, taxis passing in steady lines, footsteps echoing across concrete, conversations blending into a distant hum that felt both constant and grounding, and she walked into it without hesitation, her pace measured, her posture aligned with something internal rather than external. Because she was no longer navigating expectations, she was moving within her own direction. The sunlight filtered between buildings in narrow beams, catching the edges of glass and steel, reflecting across her path in shifting patterns, and she noticed it, not as distraction, but as presence, as proof that the world continued to expand beyond any single moment, beyond any single decision, and that realization did not overwhelm her, it steadied her, gave her a sense of scale that placed everything in its proper perspective. Across the city, Ethan Carter sat at the long conference table in the executive boardroom, the room filled with familiar faces, advisors, partners, individuals who had followed his leadership without question for years, and yet today, something subtle had changed, not in their posture, not in their words, but in the space between those things, in the pauses that lingered just a fraction longer, in the glances that were slightly more measured, because perception, once altered, does not return to its original form without resistance, and Ethan felt that resistance now, not directed at him openly, but present enough to be understood. He listened as reports were delivered, numbers presented, strategies outlined, his expression composed, his responses precise, because professionalism does not disappear with personal disruption, but beneath that structure, there was a shift, a quiet awareness that the foundation he had relied on was no longer untouched, and while no one in the room spoke about the previous night, it existed there, unspoken, influencing tone, shaping attention, defining a new context that could not be ignored. Ava entered a building several blocks from her apartment. Its exterior understated, its interior clean, intentional, the kind of space that did not rely on excess to communicate value, and as she moved through the lobby, she was greeted with recognition, not surprise, not curiosity, but familiarity, because this was a place she had built quietly over time, a space where her work had always existed separate from the identity she had carried beside Ethan, and that separation, once subtle, now felt significant, because it had been hers all along. Waiting to be fully claimed, she stepped into the elevator, the mirrored walls reflecting her image back at her, not as confirmation, but as observation, and she held that reflection for a moment, not critically, not analytically, simply acknowledging the person she saw, the alignment between what she felt and what she presented, and when the doors opened again, she stepped forward without hesitation, her path clear, her purpose no longer divided. Back in the boardroom, Ethan's phone vibrated once against the table, a small sound that cut through the measured cadence of discussion, and though he did not reach for it immediately, he was aware of it, aware of the way attention shifted slightly, aware of the subtle acknowledgement that something beyond the room held equal weight now, and when he finally glanced down, the notification was brief, a message from a senior partner confirming a media inquiry regarding the previous night, the wording neutral, the implication precise, and Ethan understood instantly that what had begun as a private fracture had already entered the public sphere. Not through accusation, not through exposure, but through visibility, through the simple fact that it had been witnessed. Ava moved through her office space with quiet efficiency, greeting her team, exchanging brief conversations that carried no trace of hesitation, because she had never brought uncertainty into this environment, and she was not about to begin now. And as she stepped into her office, closing the door gently behind her, she allowed herself a moment to stand still, not to pause, but to acknowledge, because this was not just a continuation, it was a transition into something fully her own. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze steady as the discussion continued around him, but his thoughts were no longer confined to projections or negotiations. They had shifted to something less tangible, something more foundational, the recognition that influence is not only built on authority, but on perception, on trust, on alignment, and that those elements, once questioned, require more than control to restore. They require understanding, and understanding does not arrive on demand. Ava reached for a folder on her desk, opening it with practiced familiarity, her attention moving seamlessly into the work before her, and there was no hesitation in that movement, no residual pull from the past, because she had already made the decision that allowed her to be fully present here, and that presence was not forced, it was natural, it was earned, and as she began to move forward, what followed was not recovery, not adjustment, but expansion, the kind that does not announce itself, but becomes evident in every step taken without compromise. Time did not mark the change with anything dramatic, no sudden shift in the skyline, no pause in the city's rhythm, but over the following days, something subtle and undeniable settled into place, not just around Ava Brooks, but around everything she touched, because decisions made with clarity do not echo loudly, they recalibrate quietly, and the result is not noise, but direction. In her office, sunlight now filled the space differently, or perhaps she noticed it differently, the way it stretched across her desk in the late afternoon, warming the surface where her work unfolded with steady focus, and she moved through each task with a presence that no longer felt divided, no longer balanced between expectation and identity, but rooted entirely in her own intention, and the people around her responded to that without needing explanation, because alignment, when real, is recognized without being announced. Meetings flowed with a new precision, not because her approach had changed dramatically, but because it no longer carried the quiet hesitation that comes from being partially unseen, and as she spoke, decisions formed with clarity, direction followed without confusion, and respect, the kind that is built on consistency rather than performance, deepened naturally. Without effort, without demand, across the city, Ethan Carter sat once again in his office, but the stillness there had evolved, no longer unfamiliar, no longer resisted, but acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement, something within him began to shift, not quickly, not visibly, but steadily, as he reviewed documents that now felt incomplete without context, conversations that lacked the depth he had previously overlooked, and he found himself asking questions he had never needed to ask before. Not about numbers or outcomes, but about structure, about what had been assumed rather than understood, and while the answers did not come immediately, the willingness to ask marked a change he could not ignore. The media inquiries had not escalated into spectacle, not into scandal, because there had been no chaos to amplify, no dramatic exposure to circulate, only a moment witnessed and interpreted, and that restraint, that absence of reaction, had shaped the narrative more than any statement could have, positioning Ava not as someone who had been wronged, but as someone who had chosen, and that distinction carried weight, influencing perception in ways Ethan had not anticipated, because in a world driven by reaction, restraint becomes its own form of authority. Ava walked through the city later that week, the evening air cooler now, the light softer as it settled into the edges of buildings, and she moved with the same calm certainty, her steps unhurried, her gaze steady, because she was no longer navigating what had been left behind, she was moving within what had been created, and there was no need to revisit the past to validate that movement, no need to measure progress against what she had walked away from, because the distance had already been established the moment she chose it. Ethan found himself returning to that moment more than once, not replaying it in detail, but revisiting its meaning. The clarity in her voice, the absence of accusation, the finality of her presence, and he understood now that what had unsettled him was not what she had revealed, but what she had refused to engage with, because in that refusal, she had removed the framework he had relied on to maintain control, and without it, he was left with something far more difficult to navigate, the need to understand without defense, to reflect without immediate resolution, and that process, though unfamiliar, began to reshape the way he approached not only his work, but his perception of value itself. Ava paused at a crosswalk, the signal shifting from red to green, the flow of people moving forward around her, and she stepped into it without hesitation, blending into the rhythm without losing her sense of direction, and as she crossed to the other side, there was no dramatic realization, no sudden declaration, only a quiet confirmation that she was exactly where she needed to be, not because everything ahead was known, but because everything behind no longer defined her path, and somewhere across the city, in a space that once felt entirely his, Ethan stood at the window once more, not searching for control, not measuring outcomes, but observing, allowing the view to exist without assigning ownership to it, and in that subtle shift, something within him recalibrated, not as redemption, not as resolution, but as the beginning of understanding, the kind that does not undo the past, but changes what follows. While Ava Brooks continued forward, not looking back, not needing to. Because the most powerful endings are not the ones that close loudly, but the ones that open quietly into something entirely new.